The blistering sun hung mercilessly over the city as traffic crawled through the congested streets of Logos. The noise of hawkers, honking cars, and shouting vendors filled the air, blending into a chaotic symphony of urban life. Amidst this relentless hustle, one figure sat unmoving on the cracked pavement. Ethan Carter, a man whose appearance mirrored the harshness of the street that had become his home. His clothes were torn and weathered, his beard unkempt, and his eyes held a sorrow so deep it made even the stray dogs passing by glance back in unease. His ribs jutted out against his faded shirt, his lips cracked and dry from the heat, and his stomach groaned in hunger. Yet he remained still, as if time had ceased for him. Just one more day, he whispered to himself, barely audible amidst the noise. Just one more miracle. But deep inside, he no longer believed in miracles. Life had shattered that belief long ago, and now all that remained was a man broken by the world's cruelty. Two Danfo buses honked as they sped past him, their engines loud enough to shake the air, while a child eating a gala snack carelessly dropped a piece of food near him. But Ethan's pride, the only thing he had left, refused to let him scavenge from the ground. They all see me as dirt, he thought bitterly, but once I was someone. No one knows the beggar on this street was once a child of wealth. His thoughts were interrupted as across the street, a sleek black SUV slowed to a stop. Inside, Ava Bennett, a compassionate 24-year-old woman with soft brown eyes, caught sight of him. She had just returned from volunteering at a school in Machine, and something about Ethan's presence tugged at her heart. She instinctively reached for her food flask, intending to offer him the meal she had packed, but her hand froze mid-air as a cold voice interrupted her. "Don't you dare," warned her stepmother, Sophia Bennett, with a tone as cold as the polished heels she wore. Sophia was the kind of woman who believed that kindness was a weakness, that compassion was a door to be slammed shut, and she made her daughter understand this every chance she got. But Ava couldn't look away. She stared at the man, his hollow eyes, his silent suffering. "He's starving," she said softly, torn between compassion and the harsh words of her stepmother. But in the end, the car drove away, and Ethan remained behind, still a forgotten soul in the unforgiving streets of Logos. The evening air was thick with tension as the grand dining room of the Bennett estate buzzed with the clinking of silverware and low murmurs. But there was no warmth in the air tonight. Sophia Bennett sat at the head of the table, her back straight, her eyes cold and calculating, as if she were the queen of a kingdom that no one dared challenge. The crystal chandelier overhead glimmered, casting faint shadows over the guests who dared to break the silence. Ava, still in the haze of her own thoughts, was oblivious to the fine china being set before her. Her mind was elsewhere, swirling with the image of Ethan on the street corner, his hungry eyes haunting her. But she didn't have time for pity, not in this house. The slap that came next echoed through the room, sharp and stinging. Sophia's hand came down hard on Ava's face, a sound so loud it startled the servants into silence. Ava's head snapped to the side, the sting burning on her cheek as she stood frozen, her chest tightening with the weight of the injustice. "You will obey me." Sophia's voice was icy, each word dripping with venom. "I've arranged your wedding, Ava. You'll marry Ethan, the beggar from Aja. It's done. There's no turning back." The room fell silent. Ava's breath caught in her throat. "What?" she whispered, barely able to process the cruel reality that had just been unleashed. The thought of marrying Ethan, a man she barely knew, a man whom she had only seen as a victim of the city's cruelty, felt like a nightmare made real. Sophia's eyes narrowed, and she leaned forward, her voice low and threatening. "Unless, of course," she continued, "you'd rather your brother's medical bills stop being paid." Ava's world shifted in that moment. She froze, her knees buckling slightly under the weight of the threat. Chase, her younger brother, was suffering from a life-threatening kidney condition, and Sophia knew how much he meant to her. The very thought of his treatment being cut off was enough to crush her resolve. "You wouldn't." Ava gasped, her voice trembling. But Sophia's smile was thin, predatory, as she watched the walls of Ava's resistance crumble. "Wouldn't I?" Sophia leaned back, her voice dripping with triumph. "You'll marry Ethan. You'll learn humility, and you'll learn obedience." Ava's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of disbelief and rage building inside her. She wanted to shout, to fight, to scream that this wasn't her life to control. But she couldn't, not with the weight of Chase's life hanging in the balance. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, refusing to let Sophia see her break. Charles Bennett, her father, sat at the other end of the table, silent, his face drawn with fatigue, worn down by years of manipulation and Sophia's cold hold over the family. He rubbed his temples warily. "This is madness, Sophia," he said quietly, the protest in his voice barely a whisper. But Sophia's gaze never wavered. "No, Charles," she said softly, a twisted smile curling at her lips. "This is what needs to be done." Ava clenched her fists under the table, the weight of her options crushing her. She looked from her father to Sophia, both faces masked in their own ways, but Sophia's was the only one with any real power. The walls were closing in, and there was no way out. "I'll do it," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible as she broke. Sophia's smile widened, victorious. "Good, it's settled then." That night, under the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions, Ethan Carter found himself sitting alone beneath the cracked concrete of a pedestrian bridge. The dim glow of the streetlights above cast long shadows, stretching across the street like ghosts of the past. He shared a piece of stale bread with 2 other beggars, their faces hollow and weathered by a life of neglect. Ethan broke the bread with slow, deliberate movements, each piece a bitter reminder of what his life had become. "Take," he said softly, offering the smaller pieces to his companions. "No one should starve alone." His voice carried a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold, desolate night around them. As he handed over the bread, a voice broke through the silence, carrying with it an unexpected weight. It was the street preacher, an old man who often roamed the city, murmuring prayers to the heavens. He had been watching quietly from a distance, his eyes filled with an inscrutable wisdom. "That one's different," the preacher whispered to the woman beside him. "There's grace in his eyes. You can't fake that." Ethan didn't hear them, but the words somehow found their way into his soul, echoing in the hollow space of his heart. He had forgotten what it was like to be seen, to be noticed for something other than his rags and the dirt that clung to his skin. In the distance, the unmistakable hum of a car engine broke the quietude, and the headlights of a sleek black SUV appeared from behind the alleyway. As the car slowly rolled to a stop, Sophia Bennett sat inside, her eyes narrowed in cool appraisal. Through the tinted windows, she surveyed Ethan, her gaze cold and calculating. It wasn't pity she felt. No, it was something far darker, more controlled. She had her own agenda, and Ethan was nothing more than a pawn in her twisted game. But as she observed him, something shifted in the air. Ava, sitting beside her, had already seen Ethan from the moment the SUV turned the corner. There was something about him that pulled at her heart, a sadness that mirrored her own inner turmoil. She felt a strange compulsion to reach out to him, to offer him the food from her bag, to see the humanity behind the grime that stained his face. Yet, as her fingers moved towards the door handle, Sophia's voice snapped through the car like a whip, cold and harsh. "Don't you dare," she warned, her voice low but firm. Ava froze, her hand hovering over the handle as she stared at Sophia in confusion. "But he's starving," she murmured, her voice barely audible against the roar of the city around them. Sophia's lips curled into a smirk. "He's dangerous, Ava. You're naive to think that just because he looks hungry, he's harmless. I've seen it before. Help the wrong one, and you'll regret it." Ava turned her gaze back to Ethan, who sat motionless, his eyes staring blankly at the street ahead. Something in his posture, the way his shoulders hunched with the weight of the world, made her heart ache. "I can't just ignore him," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But Sophia was unmoved, her eyes colder than before. "You'll learn, my dear. Compassion is a weakness, and in this world, weakness doesn't survive." The car sped off into the night, leaving Ethan behind, still perched on the cracked pavement, forgotten by all but the few who dared to look closer. Meanwhile, Ava sat in silence, her fingers still gripping the door handle, torn between the harsh lessons of her stepmother and the undeniable pull of her own conscience. The next few days passed in a blur of rehearsed smiles and muted conversations at the Bennett mansion. Ava's heart was heavy, her mind constantly drifting back to Ethan, the beggar on the street who had unknowingly become the center of her world. She couldn't shake the image of him sitting there, his eyes empty, his body gaunt with hunger. But it wasn't just pity that gnawed at her. It was something deeper, something she couldn't explain. She had to know more about him. She had to understand why he haunted her thoughts. That afternoon, as Ava wandered the grand empty halls of the mansion, her eyes landed on an old photograph hanging on the wall of the family's study. It was a picture of Madeline Bennett, her mother, smiling in a sunlit garden with a man who looked strikingly familiar. Ava's breath caught in her throat. The man in the photo was young, but his eyes, those same haunted eyes, belonged to Ethan. The shock of recognition hit her like a cold wave. Her fingers trembled as she traced the edges of the frame, her thoughts spiraling in disbelief. No, it can't be, she whispered to herself. How was this possible? Her mother had passed away when Ava was just a child, but the connection between the man in the photograph and Ethan seemed too undeniable. Suddenly, the door behind her creaked open, and Sophia stepped in, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She regarded Ava with an unreadable expression, her eyes flicking from the photo to her daughter. "I see you found it," she said coolly, her voice laced with something ominous. Ava turned to face her, the photograph still clutched tightly in her hand. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who is Ethan?" Sophia's lips curled into a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "A mistake, Ava," she replied, her tone dismissive. "A problem that should have never existed, but people like him have a way of slipping through the cracks, don't they?" Ava's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean by that?" she demanded, stepping closer. But Sophia's gaze remained cold, distant, as if she were watching a dangerous game unfold. "He's nothing," Sophia said, her eyes narrowing. "Just a beggar, nothing more. He was cast aside long ago. But you, Ava, you've been given a chance to learn, to understand what true power looks like, and that means letting go of your childish notions of kindness." Ava's world tilted on its axis as she processed her stepmother's words. Power, kindness, control. She had always thought of her family as a unit, but now she saw them, Sophia's, the entire world they inhabited, as a place where nothing was ever as it seemed. Ethan wasn't just a beggar. He was a part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous than Ava had ever imagined. In that moment, as the weight of her discovery settled on her shoulders, Ava knew that she couldn't turn away. She couldn't unsee the truth that was now staring her in the face. Ethan wasn't just a man broken by life. He was a man who had been broken by her family, by the very people she called her own. And as the realization hit her, the only thing she could do was look into her mother's photograph once more, the weight of the past crashing into her with the force of a storm. She had to know the truth. She had to understand what had been stolen from them all. The evening had fallen into a heavy silence, and the mansion seemed to hold its breath. Ava stood by the window, gazing out at the sprawling estate, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and revelation. The photograph of Ethan and the haunting connection to her mother lingered like a shadow in her thoughts. She could no longer ignore the pull to uncover the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. It was a truth that had been buried, hidden beneath layers of deceit and manipulation, and she knew deep down that the answers lay with Sophia. Ava's determination had solidified into something sharper, something that could no longer be pushed aside. She had already pieced together some of the story, but there was so much more to learn, so much more to understand. She couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of her life were slowly closing in, that the person she had trusted most, Sophia, was at the heart of this dark web. The thought that Sophia might have known more than she had ever let on twisted in her gut. The next day, Ava quietly slipped away from the mansion, moving with purpose through the grand halls, avoiding her stepmother's prying gaze. She needed answers, and the only person who could provide them was Pastor Jeremiah Wilson, the man who had known so much about the family's past. She found him at the small, humble church at the edge of town, an unassuming place where whispers of truth could be found if one listened closely. "Pastor," Ava began, her voice tight with urgency, "I need to know everything. About my mother. About Ethan." The old man's weathered eyes studied her for a moment before he sighed deeply, as if the weight of the past had finally caught up with him. Your mother was a kind woman, he began slowly, his voice thick with sorrow. She trusted people. Too much, perhaps. But there were whispers, Ava. Whispers about Sophia. Ava's heart raced. Whispers about Sophia? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. What kind of whispers? Pastor Jeremiah's gaze darkened. Sophia was more than your mother's assistant. She was a part of a scheme that tore this family apart. She knew too much. She had a hand in your family's downfall. He paused, his hands trembling as he folded them together in front of him. The fire, Ava? It wasn't an accident. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was the result of betrayal. Ava's breath caught in her throat. The words were like a slap to her face, each one unraveling a piece of the life she thought she understood. You mean Sophia set the fire? She asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. Pastor Jeremiah nodded gravely. Not directly, but she knew what would happen. She played a part in making sure the truth was hidden. She wanted it all, Ava. Your family's wealth, your legacy. She couldn't bear to be in the shadows anymore. Ava felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. All this time, she had trusted Sophia, admired her cold, calculated strength. But now, those same qualities felt like chains, dragging her deeper into a pit of deception. She had thought Ethan was the only victim here, but the truth was far more complicated. The pastor's voice softened, almost a whisper now. Ethan was never supposed to survive that night. He wasn't supposed to remember, but something in him did. Something strong, something that refused to let go. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. He's more than just a beggar, Ava. He's the son of the Isa family. He's your brother. The words hit her like a physical blow. Ethan was her brother? The beggar on the street was her flesh and blood? Ava staggered backward, clutching the edge of the pew for support. Her mind raced, trying to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. This was a secret, a family secret, that had been buried for over a decade. The fire, the death, the lies. All of it had been a calculated move to erase Ethan from existence, to take away his name, his legacy, his rightful place in the world. Ava looked up at the pastor, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and determination. Where is he? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Where is my brother? Pastor Jeremiah hesitated, then nodded toward the door. He's closer than you think, but you need to be careful, Ava. Sophia won't let this go easily. She's already lost everything once, and she'll do anything to protect the life she's built. But you can't back down now. You can't let her win. Ava nodded, a fire burning in her chest. She would face the truth, no matter the cost. Ethan had a right to know who he was, who they both were. And Sophia would not keep her family's past buried any longer. The time for silence had passed. The time for truth had arrived. The day had finally come. The day Ethan Carter would take back everything that was once his, everything that had been stolen from him. The mansion was alive with anticipation, its halls buzzing with the excitement of 1,000 whispered secrets and nervous glances. But inside the grand dining room, Sophia Bennett sat, her face a mask of calm, though her eyes flickered with something darker, something that Ava couldn't quite place. Ethan was no longer the beggar she had seen on the street, the one whose broken eyes haunted her dreams. He had transformed, shedding his old identity like a snake shedding its skin. He had come to claim his birthright, and nothing, not even Sophia's icy facade, could stop him now. The press conference was scheduled to begin in mere hours, and the entire estate had been turned into a media circus. Cameras were already lining the gates, eager to capture the moment when Ethan would reveal himself as the true heir to the Isa fortune. Ava stood by the window, her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the photographers adjust their lenses. But in her chest, there was no longer fear, only resolve. Today, everything would change. In the midst of the chaos, Ethan stood silently by the grand staircase, staring at the family portraits hanging on the wall. Portraits of a family that no longer existed, their smiles frozen in time, untouched by the flames of betrayal. The room behind him was filled with tension, the air thick with unspoken words. As he looked at the faces in the frames, memories came flooding back. The soft lullaby his mother used to sing to him, the warmth of his father's embrace, the laughter of a family that had once been whole. But that warmth had been consumed by fire, by greed, by a hunger for power that had shattered everything he had known. Sophia entered the room with her usual elegance, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She paused when she saw Ethan, her eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, the years of manipulation and cruelty between them seemed to hang in the air, unspoken but palpable. Sophia's lips curved into a smile, but it was a smile that held no warmth, no kindness. "So this is it then," she said, her voice cool, controlled. "You've decided to reveal yourself as the true heir." Ethan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I don't want your power, Sophia," he said quietly, his voice steady, though his eyes burned with a fire that came from deep within. "I want the truth." Her smile faltered for the briefest of moments before she regained control. "The truth?" she echoed, the word rolling off her tongue like a curse. "You think the truth matters now? After everything? Do you think the world will welcome you back with open arms just because you've remembered your name?" "I don't care about the world," Ethan replied, his voice hardening. "I care about reclaiming what was taken from me. My name, my family, my past." Ava, who had been standing in the doorway, stepped forward, her eyes locked on Ethan. "We'll do it together," she said, her voice strong, no longer the timid woman she had been. "We'll face this together, and we'll take back everything they tried to steal from us." As they stood there, side by side, Sophia's face hardened. She had always been in control, always had the power, but now she saw that control slipping through her fingers. Ethan was no longer the broken man she had kept hidden. He was standing tall, claiming his birthright, and with him, Ava. The truth was like a fire that could no longer be contained. And no matter how much Sophia tried to snuff it out, it would burn brighter than ever before. The doors to the press room swung open, and the flashes of cameras began to illuminate the room. Ethan stood at the front, his heart steady as he faced the world. "I am Ethan Carter," he began, his voice resonating through the room. "And I am the true heir to the Eza estate." The gasps from the crowd were deafening, but Ethan didn't flinch. He held his ground, his eyes scanning the faces of those who had once turned away from him. His gaze shifted to Sophia, who stood frozen at the back of the room, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Ethan took a deep breath and continued. "The fire that destroyed my family wasn't an accident. It wasn't fate. It was a lie crafted by those who wanted to erase me, to steal what was rightfully mine." A collective gasp rose from the crowd, but Ethan's eyes never wavered. He had taken back his truth, his legacy, and there was no turning back now. The room was alive with the sound of reporters shouting questions, but Ethan stood silent, his gaze locked on Sophia. She was no longer the woman who had controlled everything with her beauty and lies. She was just a woman who had lost, and Ethan, he had won. The truth had set him free, and with it, he had reclaimed everything that had been stolen from him. The past was no longer a prison. It was the foundation of his future. The mansion was cloaked in an eerie silence, its grandeur now feeling hollow, as if the walls themselves had been worn down by the weight of too many secrets. Ethan stood by the window, his eyes lost in the view of the sprawling estate that was rightfully his, yet it felt like a foreign world. The truth had come to light, but there was no satisfaction in the revelation. Only a burning sense of justice that still felt incomplete. He was no longer the man he had been just days ago, the beggar on the street forgotten by society. Yet, the battle wasn't over. Sophia was still out there, still a threat, still playing her game. Across the room, Ava sat on the edge of the couch, her hands trembling as she stared down at the letter in her lap. The letter from her mother, the one that had set her on this path, the one that had exposed Sophia for the monster she truly was. The weight of everything that had unfolded was too much to bear. The revelations, the pain, the fear, they were overwhelming, and yet Ava couldn't look away from the truth. Her life had been turned upside down, but it was time to face it. As she looked up at Ethan, her heart ached with the realization that everything she had known was a lie. He was no longer just the man she had reluctantly agreed to marry. He was Hudson Namdi Eza, the son of the Eza family. and everything she had been taught to believe about her family's power and privilege now felt like a distant memory. The world they lived in was crumbling around them, and the only thing holding them together was the fragile thread of truth. Suddenly, the door slammed open, and Sophia walked in, her steps deliberate, her eyes hard with determination. She was no longer the poised and elegant woman who had once held all the power in the mansion. Now, she was a woman desperate, willing to destroy everything to protect what little control she had left. Her eyes locked onto Ethan, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You think you've won, don't you?" she said, her voice dripping with venom. Ethan didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unwavering, as he took a step closer. "No, Sophia," he replied, his voice low and calm. "You've already lost. The truth is out. The fire was your doing. You tried to erase me, to erase us, but it's over. There's nothing left for you to control." Sophia's expression faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "You're a fool," she spat. "You have no idea what you're up against. You think Ava will stand by you? She's just as much a part of this mess as I am. She's my daughter, my creation. She will never choose you." Ava's eyes widened in disbelief. The words stung, but they didn't break her. She stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving Sophia. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of everything she had learned. "I choose the truth, and I choose Ethan. You may have raised me, Sophia, but I see you now for who you truly are." Sophia's face twisted with rage. She took a step forward, her eyes wild. "You think you're better than me? You think you can just walk away from everything I've given you? You will regret this. You will regret ever crossing me." But Ethan stepped in front of Ava, his stance protective, defiant. "No," he said, his voice firm, like steel. "It's you who will regret everything. You thought you could break me, destroy us, but we're standing, and we will take back what's ours." The silence that followed was deafening, thick with the weight of unspoken threats and promises. Sophia's chest heaved with anger, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. She knew, deep down, that she had lost. The walls she had so carefully constructed over the years were crumbling, and nothing could hold them up anymore. The game was over. Ethan turned to Ava, his gaze softening as he reached for her hand. She took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining like they had always belonged together. In that moment, the world outside no longer mattered. It was just the two of them, standing tall against everything that had tried to tear them apart. As Sophia stood there, seething with fury, Ethan and Ava walked out of the room together, leaving behind the crumbling remnants of a past that no longer had a hold on them. The future was theirs, and nothing would stand in their way. The night had fallen heavy with tension, the air thick with the weight of impending change. The press conference was over, the media frenzy quieting as the truth of Ethan Carter's identity rippled through the world. But inside the Bennett mansion, the calm was deceptive. Sophia Bennett was still reeling from the revelations, her facade of control cracking like glass under pressure. In the cold silence of her room, she sat at the vanity, her fingers trembling as she applied crimson lipstick, each stroke slow, deliberate, an attempt to regain some semblance of power. The reflection staring back at her was one she barely recognized. She had built her life on manipulation, on controlling everyone around her, but now the foundation she had so carefully constructed was crumbling before her eyes. Downstairs, Ethan, or rather, Hudson Namdi Iza, stood before the grand fireplace, his thoughts a maelstrom of confusion and newfound purpose. He had learned the truth, uncovered the dark secrets buried beneath the mansion's opulent walls. He was the true heir to the Eza fortune, not the beggar on the street, not the man who had once been forgotten by all but the suffering. Yet, as the weight of the legacy settled on his shoulders, he felt a mixture of pride and terror. He had fought to reclaim what was his, but the fight was far from over. The battle for the Izai estate wasn't just about wealth, it was about family, about justice, about revenge. Ava walked into the room, her eyes meeting his. She could see the storm inside him, the uncertainty of a man torn between the past and the future. She stepped forward, her presence a steadying force in the chaos. She didn't need to say anything. Her hand on his shoulder spoke volumes. They had come this far together, and they would finish this together. Just then, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the halls. Sophia entered, her steps sharp and measured, the heels of her shoes clicking ominously against the polished floors. Her gaze locked onto Ethan, but there was no longer any warmth in her eyes, only cold, calculated fury. She had lost everything, and now she would do whatever it took to regain control. "So you think you've won?" she asked, her voice low, venomous. Ethan didn't flinch. His gaze met hers, unyielding. "No, Sophia," he replied quietly, his voice calm but laced with conviction. "This is about truth. This is about taking back what you tried to steal from me." Sophia's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile tinged with madness. "You think the world will accept you back? That they'll welcome you with open arms after everything you've done? You're nothing more than a pawn in this game. And now that you've shown your hand, you've sealed your fate." Ava stepped forward, standing beside Ethan, her eyes locked onto Sophia with a new fire in them. "We've already won, Sophia," she said, her voice unwavering. "You can't take what's already ours. You can't erase the truth, and no matter how much you fight, you'll never win against it." For a moment, the room was thick with tension, the air crackling as if the very walls were holding their breath. Sophia's face twisted with rage, but her eyes betrayed something else: fear. She had underestimated them, underestimated the strength that had been buried deep inside both Ethan and Ava. But it was too late for regrets. Her reign was over. With one last venomous glare, Sophia turned and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, leaving Ethan and Ava standing together in the silence that followed. They had faced down the storm, and now, for the first time in their lives, they were free to rebuild on their own terms. As Ethan looked at Ava, a sense of peace washed over him. The fight had taken everything from him, but it had also given him something more precious than anything else: the truth, the legacy, and the woman by his side. And as the night stretched on, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together.